Welcome back to the promo tutorial series. Today, we'll cover the concept of entities, components, and properties in a bit more depth than when we first touched on it, as we went over navigating the Maker engine and develop a deeper understanding of the bread and butter that makes MapleStory Worlds run. Let's begin. Entities, as we learned, are essentially the containers for the functional parts of any object in your world. On the image we see on screen, can you identify which are the entities? All of the items that we've highlighted in the red box are the entities. However, the fact that these entities are visible on screen aren't actually what defines these as entities. The reason these entities are visible is because of a component known as a Sprite render component that makes them visible. The entity itself is actually the invisible container that holds this Sprite render component. When we select any entity in our world, the property window, as we learned in Chapter 1, shows all of the components associated with this entity. The Sprite render component that I referenced earlier would be found here as well. Each component has what are called properties. These properties are the settings that define how the component will function. The Sprite renderer, for example, takes in what we call a Sprite RUID as its property value. And this ID is what defines which sprite, which is another term for image, is rendered on screen. The transform component is what defines the position of our entity, as well as its scale and rotation within our world. So to recap, the entity is the container for the components give the entity its function, and the properties define the settings for how the component will function. This relationship between entity, component, and property allow the objects in our world to be modular and our code easily reusable. Take this pizza for example. What kinds of components would this pizza have? For the sake of argument, let's pretend this pizza was a margarita pizza. If I were to assign some imaginary components to this pizza, I could say that this pizza has a dough component, a sauce component, a cheese component, and a tomato component. Each component would have its own properties such as quantity, freshness, etc. And now if I wanted to turn this into, say, a pepperoni pizza, instead of remaking the entire pizza from scratch, all I would have to do is swap out the component that makes it a margarita pizza and replace it with the component that makes it a pepperoni pizza. In this way, we can reuse the dough, sauce, and cheese components that we've already prepared and just add the pepperoni component. Let's swap gears to the Maker and see some of these components in action. We have a simple scene set up here. We have an empty project with some terrain that I've set up and a spawn point. Let's go into the preset list and make sure that we are on the Object tab. And we'll select any object. Let's select Object 9 and place that into our world. Going back into the Property panel, we can see the different components that make up this entity. We have the Transform component and the Sprite Render component. The Transform component defines the positional and rotational values for this entity. The Position property has X, Y, and Z coordinate values. And we can see that as I modify the X value, it moves left and right. The Y value moves it up and down. And the Z value has no visual effect on the entity because this is 2D. We also have the Z rotation property that modifies the rotational value of our entity. Below that, we have the Sprite Render component, and the Sprite Render component is what allows this entity to be visible on screen. The Sprite Render component has a Sprite RUID value that will tell the Sprite Render component which image to render on screen. Now, not all entities will have the Sprite Render component, which means that some entities will just be functional and not have a visible component. For example, we have this map entity up here that houses all of the entities within our world and has map and foothold components that has settings for how this map will function. Going back to our bottle object, we can replace this Sprite RUID property with a different RUID of our choosing. We'll go into the Resource Storage tab and make sure we are selected on MSW Resources. And we'll filter by IP by selecting on this dropdown. At the time of this recording, we only have two IPs. We have the MapleStory IP and the Kingdom of the Winds IP. We'll select MapleStory and go into our monster folder, and we'll search for a sprite. Let's say, for example, this one. And we'll click on the Copy RUID button. And we'll go back into our scene, and we will replace this Sprite RUID with the value we just copied, and press Enter. And we can see that our sprite has replaced with the Sprite RUID that we have just pasted in. We can also replace this RUID with an animated RUID. We'll go back into the Resource Storage panel, and this time, let's open up the animation clip folder, and we'll go into the monster folder. And this time, let's bring in, for example, this monster here. We can click on the eye in the bottom right hand corner to view the details window, where we can see the different properties associated with the sprite. For example, we have the tags, the registration date, and other information related to the sprite. We have the copy RUID button again. We'll click on this and we'll go back into the scene and we'll paste in our new RUID with the animated one. And we can see that now our sprite is animated. We'll delete this entity and move on to another example. Let's go back into the preset list, and this time let's go into the Footholds tab and let's drag in, let's say, Foothold 19. So we'll click and place that into our world and go into the property window to view the components. We can see, as usual, we have the transform component and we have the sprite render component. But a new component that's unique to this entity is that we have the custom Foothold component. This custom Foothold component will allow our entity to be walkable. So if we toggle on our foothold lines at the upper portion of our scene panel, we can see the red lines where our character can stand on. We can see red lines above our barrel entity as well. So the foothold line above the barrel is defined by our edgeless property. So if we expand this, we can see a size array, which is another word for a collection. And if we expand that, we can see two different coordinate points. These coordinate points are relative to the position of the barrel and are offset points based on that position. So for example, we have our first point at negative 0.5 in the x relative to our barrel position, and we have 0.71 in the y, which will mark this red point here. We have another point at 0.13 in the positive x direction, and we have a positive y direction of 0.71, which will define this point right here. The connection between these 2 points will be what defines the foothold. So if I press play, we can see that our character can jump and stand on our barrel. Let's look at another example. We'll go back into our preset list, and this time we'll select the ladder tab. And we have a collection of different ladders here. Let's select ladder 14, for example, and place that into our world. Going back into the property panel, we can see the different components associated with this entity again. We can see that we have a transform component and we have a sprite render component, but this is different in that this is a climbable sprite render component. The only difference between this component and the original sprite render component is that this component has a tiled size property. Now we have two different handles, one above the sprite and one below the sprite. And if you click and drag this handle, we can see that our tiled size property value is increasing and decreasing, and our ladder is increasing and decreasing in length. If we click and drag the handle above, we can also vertically tile this ladder up and down. We also have a climbable component with a collider property. This climbable component will define the range that our character will be able to interact with the ladder. So if we click on the edit button of our collider property, we can see a green box that appears. This box is the range that our character can interact with this ladder. Let's delete this ladder and move to the next example. Let's look at one final example here. Going back into our preset list, we'll this time select the portals tab, and let's drag in portal 10. Back to the property panel, we can see the transform component and the sprite render component as normal, but we have two new components here. We have the portal component and we have a tag component. The portal component is what manages to teleport between two different portals. We have a collider property that will define the interactable range of our portal. We have a portal entity ref property that will define the target portal that our character will teleport to when we interact with this portal. Below that, we have a tag component, which is mainly used for scripting purposes, and just defines a tag associated with this entity that we can reference in script. Let's go back to our preset list, and let's bring out another portal. Let's bring out portal 12. And switch back to our property panel. If we look at our portal entity ref property, we can see that its current value is nil, which basically means it's unassigned. So let's click on this button on the right side, and we'll target portal 10 as the target portal to teleport to. And for our other portal, we'll target portal 12. If I press play now, as I interact with this portal, it teleports to the other portal, and I can swap and teleport between the two different portals. The final concept that I want to go over is the concept of models. Now, a lot of times when you're removing components, adding components, changing properties within the components, you don't want to have to keep redoing the same work over and over again. And models will provide a convenient way of saving those settings, components and property settings, as a blueprint so that you don't have to keep remaking those over and over again. Let's go into our preset list, and this time let's switch to the Monsters tab. And let's drag in any object here. Let's select this coffee machine monster, monster 9, and place that into our world. If we go into the property panel, we can see that we have a whole host of different components that we won't go into in detail. But if we press play, our monster can wander around our world, but we cannot actually take damage from it, and we also can't deal damage to our monster. Now, because this project has been created from scratch and not from one of the templates from chapter 1, we have to write some scripts of our own. However, we can import some of those custom scripts from those other templates if we'd like. To do this, we'll hold Ctrl, Alt, and 3 to open up the script manager. Alternatively, we can go into Window and open up the script manager that way. And the components that we need are monster, monster attack, and player hit. We'll click on the import button for each of these components, and we can see them drop into our My Desk folder one by one as we import these in. And we'll close out the script manager window, and we'll select our monster again. Down at the bottom, we can add a new component. So we'll click on Add Component. We'll search for the monster component, and we'll place that in, and verify that we have the monster component attached, and we'll also import in the monster attack. Now, the monster component holds properties for the max HP, the current HP, when this monster is defeated, will it respawn, what the delay is after respawning, what the delay is after being defeated and being destroyed. And the monster attack contains behaviors for dealing damage to our player. Now again, these are custom script components, and if you open up any one of these components, for example the monster, we can see the different scripts associated with this component and what allow this component to work. Let's go back into the scene and select our monster, and let's press play. If we walk into the monster now, we still cannot take damage or deal damage to our monster. The reason why is because our monster has behaviors associated with dealing and taking damage, but our player doesn't yet have that. So let's go into our default player and scroll all the way down to our add component, and let's add in the player attack component. And if we scroll up, we can verify that our player attack has been added in. However, if we scroll down and try to add the player hit component, we can see that we cannot add our player hit component, and it's also not showing up during our search. This is because our player hit component, if we open this up, is an extension of the hit component. And we'll go into extensions in more detail as we cover scripting, but if you look into our default player and scroll all the way down, we can see that we already have a hit component. The player hit component, because it extends our hit component, our player entity thinks that we already have the hit component attached, so we won't allow it to add a second one. So we need to remove this component. However, when we go to try to remove it, our hit component remains no matter how many times we try to remove this component. The reason for that is because our default player entity is based on a model. If you go into our base environment folder and go into the native model, and we select the player model, we have some components that are attached to this player by default. And unless we remove it here, we cannot remove components from the default player. So any components that our player model has cannot be removed from the default player entity, but has to be removed from the player model. So we'll scroll down and we'll attempt to remove this hit component from here. And we can see that it has been successfully removed. And going back into the default player, we can see that it also has been removed from here as well. So let's try adding in the player hit again. and it shows up, and we can add this component in. And scrolling all the way up, we can verify this player hit component is now successfully attached. The player attack component is the component that allows us to deal damage to other entities, and the player hit component is what allows other entities to deal damage to us. So with these 4 components that we've added in, let's press play again. And this time, as we walk into the monster, we can see that we are now taking damage. And as I deal damage to the monster, we can see that the monster also takes damage, and then when it runs out of health, it is defeated. So now we have a functioning monster that can deal and receive damage, and it would be such a waste to have to redo this effort all over again every single time we want to duplicate this monster. So what we can do is we can right click and we can create a model from this entity, and it creates our model. And now we can just drag these in and create copies of our entity without having to recreate this from scratch every time. And it gives us a way to reference a model from script to start spawning in these monsters at different timings that we'd like. So pressing play, we can see that all of our monsters are working well. I can deal damage to them, and they all can be defeated. Thank you so much for joining me in today's video. Today we've taken a deeper dive into entity, components, and properties. Next time, we'll dive into UI in Worlds and learn about the specifics of screen coordinates and the various UI editor tools available to you.